I have to stand right here? Is that how that works? All right. So I'm going to do something a lot more lighthearted because I usually deal with these easier, simpler issues that we run into as testers more than, the next leap thing or whatever. I've seen a lot of cool stuff, and my stuff's not like that. It's more like simplifying or making things quicker that we all do every day kind of stuff. So maybe I'm curing the cold instead of cancer or something. I don't know. So I'm going to talk about a little bit about metrics and vulnerabilities, but more from an implementation perspective, because a lot of us talk a lot of theory, but I don't see a lot of actual implementation of all the theory that we talk. The first couple slides is just, I don't know, somewhat of a soapbox, and it kind of rolls into some stuff I helped with. So two things with vulnerability assessment testing, and that's really the perspective that I'm going to talk from, is vulnerability assessment versus pen testing. So the way I see that differential is that vulnerability testing is a lot more encompassing. It's got a lot more breadth and a lot more depth than your pen testing will usually have. Pen testing is from the perspective of an attacker. You're going to be going through security boundaries. Vulnerability assessment, you really shouldn't have all those security boundaries in your way. The design is really to get the best quality data you can get about your system, so you really know what's going on. So depth of testing, one of the major things that changed in the last year and a half, and since we're in DC, I'm going to talk a little bit from federal perspective, is that NIST required authenticated scanning and authenticated testing for high systems. Although, and that might be kind of surprising to everybody that's been using vulnerability scanners for a long time. But still, for low and moderate systems, they don't even require authentication of your vulnerability scanners or test tools or this, that, or the other. But one of the things that nobody ever really does is kind of look to see what kind of depth they're getting. They set up their scanner for authentication, but they don't actually look at the results to see if they authenticated or if they're getting, or what that coverage is. Did I get authenticated to 20% of the systems, 60% of the systems? What am I really looking at, and what does that really represent? So I've done a little bit with scripting. I have a script that I've talked about in the past, if you've seen my stuff, called Coverage Validate, that'll go through and it'll kind of validate a couple of things. One of them is whether you're scanned and authenticated or not. Most of my examples are done with Nessus, but they really can apply to any product. One of the things is there is a bug in Nessus in the plugin for failed authentication. The thing about it is kind of the reverse of usually what we think of as a bug. It's a false negative bug where it'll say you authenticated when you didn't really authenticate on a lot of operating systems. If you meet the criteria of, I could actually decide what operating system it was, but then say I have all the ports blocked for actual authentication, Nessus will say you authenticated whether you did or didn't, because it knew what the operating system was and the plugin's written a little bit off. I think they've got, I talked with them a little bit, and they've got it fixed for Windows, I believe, at this point, but it's not fixed for Linux. So if your host signatures is the kind of Linux that Nessus can authenticate to, and there's a firewall in place, so it just outright blocks the ports for authentication, then it'll say you authenticated whether you did or didn't. So something you might watch for if you're on the system administration side of this vulnerability process versus the tester side of this process. Next thing is breadth of testing, and I don't think a lot of people think much about this, but I deal a lot of things where we'll come in and do a test, and then these administrators want to know kind of how to fix things, and really concentrating on repeat findings. They don't really want repeat findings in this world. To do that, you really have to know what's on your network, or what should be on your network. There's not enough people that pay enough attention to what should be on their network, or have their network to a stage where it's locked down and there's only certain devices on their network, so on and so forth. I know I'm terribly preaching to the choir in this aspect, but I see it all the time in reports and things that nobody does this analysis to see what was supposed to be on the network, what did I find, what does that represent? Did I find extra hosts? Did I find missing hosts? The last 10, 20 places I've been to this year, I've found hundreds of extra devices and a handful of missing devices by the time I'm done with these assessments, where they haven't really kept track of the flow in their network of what they're getting rid of or where something moved to and all that kind of thing. And a lot of them are really shocked when you come back and say, hey, you have 100 extra devices that aren't in your inventory sitting on your network. And this is clear up to, national critical systems, big, these high-end guys, you'd expect them to understand their inventory. Such a fundamental process, and they don't. It's all over the place. But the more important thing from a vulnerability perspective is, really understanding what you're looking at. You bring one of these shops and it just does vulnerability assessment or pen testing or any of these things. how does that relate to your inventory? Did they really analyze 30% of your network? Did they analyze 80% of the network? Or did they really touch every device? That's something that hole can account for a lot of things. So make sure to do good quality breadth of testing. Both of them are kind of required by NIST, but you don't need a requirement for that kind of stuff. I did a little bit of help, very minor help with a lot of experts on the Pentest Standard, and there's a lot of people in this room that contributed to that as well as understand it. But if you haven't seen it, that's why I threw this slide in. This is absolutely a fantastic thing to go check out, this Pentest Execution Standard. There's a whole lot of data out there. I helped, like I say, a very minor bit with the vulnerability analysis portion, but you're going to see some of the same verbiage in there that says, proper depth and breadth of testing. It's an important piece when you're talking vulnerability analysis. And I know a lot of us are, pen testers. I don't really expect a pen test, and there is a really mistaken look at pen testing that says, pen testing is all encompassing. I don't think pen testing is necessarily usually all encompassing. Usually budget and time run out long before you've finished testing every single piece of the network. So I don't ever necessarily consider that. So this talk basically focuses on a couple of things. I wrote a couple of new scripts, if you're familiar with my stuff, and they were really to answer these questions that don't always amount to a lot of things, but we always get asked, and it's usually just kind of like, you're moderate. So I was really going, well, what is that based on? Well, let me give you something to base it on that at least is based on a number and kind of done the same way every time. So at least you have some kind of watermark, and it makes some amount of sense. So the questions were, I always get, what is the worst machine? What are the worst 10 machines? What are the worst 20 machines? Executive summary type of stuff. What's the overall risk of my network? How do you boil down, somebody that's got all these critical holes and all these problems to high, moderate, or low without just saying everybody's high all the time. And, and then also how to fix it. What order should you put it in? Where can they get the most bang for their buck? How can I get rid of the findings the quickest? What will have the most impact? So those are the questions I was kind of trying to really automate. Like I say, I try to take these low-level questions and make them, instantaneous answer kind of things. A lot of this work stemmed from this question: what is a measurement? And I've found this particular definition of what a measurement is pretty interesting, because a measurement is really anything that reduces your uncertainty of a question. So any way I can make you understand more about that question than you knew before, that's helpful. So lose that concentration on the fact that a measurement is exact, that I have to get the perfect number. Like when I say your network is moderate risk, that's exactly what it is, and I took into consideration every factor under the sun that all of us are talking about, the surface area of this, whether there was a firewall or mitigation in place or something I missed during the 2 days I was there when you lived there all the time. I'm just trying to help you understand it a little bit better than you understood it before in some quantifiable way. So when I started on this, I needed a source for math. I decided to go with NIST. I do a lot of federal work, so I headed down that track. There's a lot of other sources for it. This one turns out to be pretty easy. But the reason I needed a source for math is criticality. You get every vulnerability scanner, every product says, it's high, moderate, low, critical, whatever. You have CVSS that gives stuff a score. But I was really more interested in the impact of something. How important is that host in your network? Is it your domain controller, or is it the secretary's workstation that has the critical? What is the difference between that? How much is that worth? If the impact is to your domain controller, it's worse. We all know it's worse. But is it 10 times worse? Is it 100 times worse? Is it 1,000 times worse? How much worse is it? And that's something that can easily be debated till the end of time. I took the math source from NIST that says that right now I'm going with threat to impact to 10 times ratio. So the importance of the host in your network is 10 times more important than the threat source. So if you have a critical on the secretary's workstation, versus the domain controller, you got a 10 times impact there. So I took that and implemented it into actual code, because I think a lot of us talk about these math and these ratios and that you have to consider threat and we have to consider impact and the surface area and all these things. But how many times you ran a vulnerability scan on your network and took all those things into consideration at the end of the day and put all that work into it? So I tried to automate that into how can I do 2 minutes worth of work and implement that theory. So I created a statistics script. It's done in Java. Unfortunately, Java's what I learned in, so that's what it's in. Feel free to adapt it to anything. It's only a couple hundred lines. But it works with Nessus v2 files for this implementation. It's out on my site. You're welcome to it. Simple command line tool. I don't use the GUI in the Java. Really, like I say, I just want disposable data. I want to type one command. I want the answer, and I want to move on as an assessor. I don't want to spend my life doing vulnerability assessment. It has a couple features that Nessus doesn't natively have. So this is a useful thing as testers. It can merge multiple files. Nessus still can't merge multiple files. Why, I don't know. But you can't scan something and then scan something else and get two XML structures. It won't merge it. So that's not really useful to us as testers, especially when you're talking about depth and breadth of testing, because you're going to try to get 100% of the network, and that's not going to happen in one scan. But you're going to write one report. You're not going to write a separate report for all these different scans, so why it can't merge it, I don't know. And it has an adjustable impact, because impact at the end of the day, you have to understand your network, and my script is not going to understand your network. You're going to understand your network. So I default out everything to low, and it's up to you to understand the impact to your network. One of the things I have been doing with that works pretty effectively for impact, if you need an arbitrary guide for it, is to take the FIPS 199 rating of your network if you do that process, which takes into consideration how important the actual data is on the machines. The machines are relevant, but what data is actually on the machine, and it gives you a high, moderate, or low. That's a good place to start, and then work from a spread. So if it's high, moderate, or low, you can take the moderate rating in the impact scale, and then you can kind of spread that apart and say, well, the most important things, the domain control is at the top end of the moderate scale. The other ones are at the bottom. What it ends up looking like, see if I can get this up. I'll give you a little example. It ends up looking something like this, and unfortunately I can't, I got some wicked resolutions, but basically you're going to get all your IP addresses, you're going to get some counts of CVSS for each of the boxes. It's going to total the CVSS score for all of those vulnerabilities. So I needed a numerical thing to base things off of, so CVSS provided that. So I can get an arbitrary total count, which it's just a number, but obviously more is going to be higher. And then you've got a host criticality that it uses as a multiplier, and it gives you an overall risk score. And we're not worried so much about where that number is or anything. It's just to get those multipliers in place so you know who the worst host is. Because it's easy to debate who the worst host is, but who is worse? Is the guy missing the root password worse than the guy that has 100 mediums? Is the guy with 100 highs worse than the guy with one critical? It's very arbitrary. And when you're scanning 3,000 or 4,000 machines and you're going to tell somebody what to fix first, this is a simple baseline to work from. It's not designed to be, the end-all be-all. It's designed to just give you a way to get a number and move on, with your assessment. So that's XML stats. Basically, it'll run through a Nessus file. It's going to give you some automatic calculations. It'll also answer by averaging all that out what the average box is on your network. So you can say, on average, your network's low, moderate, or high, and it's based on averages of the CVSS score with the impact multiplier for your entire network. And that way you can, when you do your conclusion, your risk assessment, you got some answer that's based on, some type of standard statistics that's repeatable. And they can see as they patch things how that number goes down. This second script comes from a bit of code that I wrote over the weekend, and it came from a conversation on assessment. But we basically said, well, some people don't fix host to host. A lot of people fix vulnerability to vulnerability. So how can we get the most impact into that process from a break fix? So I did this one was a simple twist on another script I did. So basically, this will take all your Nessus statistics or your findings. It'll roll them up unique. So you'll get one line per vulnerability. So if it's missing Microsoft patch X, it's going to be one line in this table, and it's going to have all the hosts associated with it. But the twist on it is that I'm actually going to do a little bit of math on top of that and say, okay, well, I have a critical vulnerability, and that critical vulnerability is on 50 hosts, versus I have another critical vulnerability that's just as bad, but it's only on 2 hosts. So I'm going to say that the guy that's on 50 hosts is going to have a lot more fix impact to your organization as a whole. It's going to have more risk reduction than the other ones. So kind of a way to sort by vulnerability and give you the most impact to your break fix scenario. And it's relatively quick. Again, it merges multiple files, so I've used it on 10,000 hosts, 300 Nessus files. It'll merge them all together. Works pretty efficiently, and it'll give you a priority score.
Do you multiply on the host value?
In this instance, I don't add in an impact multiplier per host, just a quantity of hosts.
That might be something to think
but
about.
that would be definitely a way. The problem that I've run into from impact, and that's actually all I got. It's a pretty quick little thing on a couple of scripts. The problem I've run into on impact as a whole, is impact has been a theory in security for a long, long time. How important is your host, understand your network, all these type of things. But has anybody ever seen an inventory that has a list of who's the most important, in their network, or a ranking of, what the most important things are, or anything like that? It's just not data that's available to us as testers. So that's why it doesn't make it into these processes. If you go into a shop for a week and do a vulnerability assessment, if that data is not available, it's just not going to get factored in. So it really is an interesting problem where I'm hoping people will start to consider impact a little more. And I think some of these graphing things, visualizing this data would also be very interesting. I haven't had enough time to do that. For the most part, I try to automate what ends up in my reports. Go for it.
Are you looking at the files themselves and processing the text, or are you using the Nessus APIs to query the data out?
I'm actually using the .nessus v2 files, which is actually just an XML structure. It's not, I used to do a lot of this stuff from the MBE files, which is just pipe delimited data, but at one point in time, they decommissioned that file type, and now they've brought it back, but in that, gap, I basically rewrote everything in XML. So, go for it.
Could you aggregate your data with a remediation database to use pivot tables and do what-if analysis on times to remediate, things like that, and then kind of like an optimized perspective on reducing risk?
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. And I'm looking for, there's obviously a lot more factors, and I'm sure some of them are popping into everybody's mind. I'm looking at, time to remediate is obviously a big factor. Surface area is one that I'd like to factor in at some point because, whether this thing's right behind a firewall or is it, do I add a multiplier because it's an internal system versus an external host, or, all those kind of things can adjust impact. There's a lot of other factors, and I think as you go, and you add those factors and add more and more to that, you get a more quantifiable answer and a more direct answer as to the risk in your environment. My hope was to just progress that one step further and really start thinking of impact and what percentage of the picture you're looking at. If you just plug into a network and run an Nessus scan on the whole segment and you get back a thing and you say, this is how your network is, then I don't think you're looking at the whole picture, and the question really becomes for me, what percentage of that picture am I looking at? And what things did I miss? And if I'm really worried about repeat findings, did I test 100% of my stuff? Did I really wipe that finding off of my network completely?